Double Diamond works wonders.
Works wonders, works wonders. That jingle wasn't just a commercial, it was a psychological operation. It was everywhere. On the telly, on the radio, plastered across billboards. It featured catchy music and animated characters that made the beer feel like a cheerful, reliable friend. Chink chink, that's the sound of 2 glasses toasted in every pub from Penzance to Perth. But behind the catchy tune lies one of the most fascinating double lives in the history of British drinking. You see, Double Diamond had a pedigree that would make a royal blush. It dated back to 1876 in Burton-on-Trent, the holy land of British brewing. For nearly a century, it was a proper pale ale, a respected bottle-conditioned drink with depth and character. But in the 1960s, the owners, Ind Coop, decided to take this heritage and turn it into a keg revolution. They pasteurized it, chilled it, and turned it into a consistent fizzy 3.8% bitter that tasted the same in every single pub. It was industrialized nostalgia. The royal scandal. Here is the logic flip that makes this story truly man. Salty. While the ordinary British workman was standing at the bar drinking the watered-down metallic keg version, there was a persistent whisper across the country. The rumour? Prince Philip was a superfan. And it wasn't just a rumour. Internal brewery records and various sources suggest that Buckingham Palace had regular deliveries of Double Diamond. But here is the catch. The royals weren't drinking the fizzy keg stuff you got down at the local. They were drinking the original bottled version, a potent 5.2% ABV brew that was a completely different animal. The reality, the brand was a masterpiece of class illusion. The logic, they used the image of the premium bottled ale, the one the prince drank, to sell the cheap keg bitter to the masses. It was the ultimate bait and switch of the 20th century. The death of the wonder. By the early 80s, the wonder had started to fade. Why? Because Double Diamond was caught in a no-man's land. One, the real ale crowd hated it because it was a soulless keg beer. The younger generation thought it was uncool and started moving toward the sleek, icy cold lagers coming from Europe. Double Diamond tried to be everything to everyone, the working man's pint and the prince's choice, and ended up being nothing to no one. It died because it lost its truth. We realized that a jingle, no matter how catchy, couldn't mask the taste of a beer that had traded its soul for consistency. I think about that jingle often. It's a reminder of a time when we were more susceptible to a good tune than a good taste. We didn't just drink the beer, we drank the marketing. And while it worked wonders for the brewery's bank account for a few decades, it couldn't survive the moment we started asking, what's actually in the glass? Walk into any British pub today, and what do you see? A forest of silver taps pouring icy cold, fizzy lager. It's so normal we don't even think about it. But if you took a time machine back to 1960, the scene would look very different. Back then, lager was a dirty word. If a man walked into a pub and ordered a lager, the old-timers at the bar would probably stop talking and stare. In 1960, lager accounted for exactly 1% of the British beer market. It was seen as foreign, fizzy, and most damningly in the eyes of the post-war generation, a drink for women. Then came Harp. Launched in 1961, Harp wasn't just a beer, it was a mission. It was a joint venture between the giants, Guinness, Courage, and Scottish and Newcastle. They had one goal, to convince the British man that drinking a cold, blonde beer didn't make him any less of a real man. Imagine the sound of that era. Disc, pop. The sound of a cold bottle being opened, glug, glug, glug. The sight of tiny, frantic bubbles racing to the top of a tall, slender glass. It looked like the future. It looked like the continent. The logic of the heat wave. For 15 years, Harp struggled. They tried European branding. They tried sleek ads, but the British palate was stubborn. We liked our beer warm, flat, and heavy. We liked the bitter taste of a rainy Tuesday. But then the universe intervened. The summer of 1976 hit Britain like a sledgehammer. It was the hottest summer on record. The ground cracked, the reservoirs dried up, and suddenly the idea of a lukewarm, thick, heavy bitter felt like drinking liquid wool. The tipping point. People didn't want flavor or heritage anymore. They wanted cold. The salty truth. Nature did the marketing that the advertising agencies couldn't. 1976 was the year Britain fell in love with the cold one. By the mid-70s, lager's market share jumped from almost nothing to 20%. The logic flip. Why we swapped heart for ice. Here is the angle most people miss. We didn't switch to lager because we suddenly developed sophisticated European tastes. We switched because of the package holiday. In the 70s, the working class started flying to Spain for 2 weeks of sun. They spent 14 days drinking cold San Miguel under a hot sun, and they brought that habit back to a grey, rainy Manchester. Harp was there waiting for them. But here's the Mant part. Harp paved the way for the big boys, Carling, Stella, and Heineken. Once the British man was convinced that lager was okay, he realized he didn't need to stay loyal to the British-made Harp. He wanted the real foreign stuff. Harp did all the hard work of breaking the bitter taboo, only to be devoured by the very continental brands it tried to imitate. I remember seeing my granddad try his first lager in the late 70s. He took a sip, made a face like he'd just swallowed a battery, and said, "It's like drinking expensive wind." He was right in a way. We traded the rich, complex, living character of our local ales for the predictable, icy cold wind of the lager tap. We won the battle for convenience and refreshment, but we lost the unique heaviness of the British afternoon. We traded the pub as a shelter for the pub as a party, and we've been chasing that feeling ever since. If you walked into a crowded pub in the 1960s and looked at the bar, you'd see something that doesn't really exist anymore. You wouldn't just see glasses, you'd see a sea of half-and-half pairs, a half-pint glass of bitter sitting next to a small, stout little bottle. This was the brown and bitter, the original unofficial cocktail of the British working class. The star of this show wasn't the draft beer, it was the bottle. Man's brown ale. Pop, that's the sound of the metal cap coming off. Glug, glug. Imagine the sight of this dark mahogany liquid swirling into the amber bitter. It didn't just mix, it transformed the drink.
Now, why did millions of men do this every single night? The history books might call it a serving suggestion, but the reality was much more practical. In the mid-20th century, the quality of draft bitter could be, let's say, unpredictable. If the pipes were dirty or the barrel was old, the beer could be harsh, vinegary, or bone dry. The brown was the fix. Mann's was the original sweet brown ale. First brewed in 1902, it was dark, malty, and thick as syrup. At only 3% alcohol, it wasn't there to get you drunk, it was there to polish the pint. It added sugar, body, and a creamy head to a bitter that was struggling to be drinkable. The logic of the mixologist. Here is the angle most people miss. Your granddad was actually a master of customization long before the term existed. The balance, the bitter provided the bite and the hop aroma, the Mann's provided the smoothness and the sweetness. The economy, you could stretch out a night by ordering halves. It was a way to stay in the pub longer, talking more and spending less without losing your footing. But here is the man, or salty part, that the modern craft beer world hates to admit. Today, we pay £8 for a pastry stout or a chocolate porter that tastes like liquid dessert. We think we're being revolutionary, but your dad was doing exactly the same thing 50 years ago with a bottle of Mann's. He was engineering his flavor profile on a budget. The death of the half bottle. So, why did it die? It wasn't because the beer was bad. It was because of ego. By the late 70s and 80s, drinking was becoming more about image. Carrying a small, sweet bottle of brown ale started to look old-fashioned. It was what your nan drank, or what old men in flat caps did. Younger drinkers wanted a pure product. They wanted a pint of lager that came out of a shiny tap, looking exactly like the one in the advert. They didn't want to mess with their drink. I remember watching my own father do the brown and bitter ritual. There was a specific grace to it, the way he'd pour just a third of the bottle, take a sip, then top it up again as the pint went down. It was a slow, evolving experience.
When we stopped mixing, we lost a bit of our agency as drinkers. We started accepting whatever the brewery gave us, exactly as they gave it. We traded the art of the mix for the convenience of the pour. And honestly, I think the pubs were a little more interesting when everyone was their own bartender. If there was an award for the most confusingly brilliant marketing in the history of British advertising, it would go, without question, to a brand called Courage Tavern. Launched in the late 1960s, this beer didn't try to sell you on its heritage or its hops. Instead, it plastered one single cryptic sentence across every billboard and television screen in the country. Courage Tavern. It's what your right arm's for. Wait, stop. Think about that for a second. What your right arm's for. It was a slogan that made absolutely no sense, yet somehow it made perfect sense. It was a masterpiece of vague masculinity. It didn't need to explain the beer, it just needed to link the physical act of lifting a pint to the very essence of being a man. It suggested that your entire right arm, all that bone, muscle and sinew, had been evolved over millions of years for the sole purpose of hoisting a cold glass of tavern to your face. But here is the munt reality. While the slogan was a work of art, the beer inside the glass was, well, it was a bit of a placeholder. The logic of the national average. Courage Tavern was a keg bitter, meaning it was filtered, chilled and carbonated to be consistent. Psst, glug glug glug. It was light brown, slightly sweet, and fizzy enough to make you burp before you'd even finished your first sentence. In the early 70s, the big breweries like Courage were obsessed with the national brand. They didn't want you to have a local taste, they wanted you to have a courage taste. They were trying to create the Big Mac of beer, something that tasted exactly the same in a seaside pub in Brighton as it did in a rainy tavern in Leeds. The strategy: use a high-impact, nonsensical slogan to distract from a mediocre product. The result? It worked for a while. Tavern became one of the biggest names in the country because it was catchy. You didn't buy the beer, you bought the feeling of being in on the joke.
The logic flip. Why the best slogan led to the quickest death. Here's the angle most people miss. Courage Tavern died because it was too successful at being average. In the mid-70s, the British beer market began to split. On one side, you had the rise of cold, refreshing lagers like Harp. On the other, you had the real ale revolution, Camera, fighting for complex traditional flavours. Courage Tavern was stuck in the middle. It wasn't cold enough to be a lager, and it wasn't real enough to be a craft ale. It was the beige of the beer world. When the market specialised, the middle-of-the-road brands were the first to be run over. By the late 70s, the slogans had stopped working, and Courage eventually merged with Scottish and Newcastle. The tavern was closed for good. I remember an old neighbour of mine, Mr. Henderson. He was a right-arm loyalist. I asked him once why he liked it, and he just laughed and said, "I don't know if I like the taste, lad, but I like the way the glass feels in my hand when the advert comes on." That's the power of muscle memory marketing. We didn't just drink tavern, we performed it. We traded that strange physical connection for a world of brand values and lifestyle choices. Modern ads try to tell us that beer will make us more popular or more adventurous. Courage Tavern was simpler. It just told us we had a right arm and it gave us something to do with it. Sometimes I think we overcomplicate things. Maybe we just need a reason to lift our arms again. Imagine it's 1975. You're in a pub in London or the Midlands, and suddenly the bar looks like it's been decorated for a Highland wedding. Everywhere you look, there's a pattern of red, black and white squares. This was Younger's Tartan Special.
If you were a teenager in the mid-70s, this wasn't just a beer, it was likely your first legal pint. Clack, that's the sound of those heavy, brightly coloured cans being stacked on a table in a crowded beer garden. While other brands were trying to look modern or medical, Younger's went the other way. They leaned so hard into Scottish stereotypes that it almost felt like a caricature. Their slogan, "Drink it, don't wear it." But here's the logic flip that everyone forgets. Tartan Special wasn't successful because it was Scottish. It was successful because it was the perfect compromise. The logic of the bridge beer. In the 70s, there was a war going on between the old guard, who drank thick, warm, flat bitter, and the young rebels who wanted icy cold, fizzy lager. Tartan Special sat right in the middle. The profile, it was smooth, slightly sweet, and had a heavy mouthfeel at 3.7% ABV. The sensation, gulp? It felt like a proper beer, but it didn't have that intimidating bitterness that made your face scrunch up. It was the training wheels for a generation of drinkers. But why did it disappear? Here is the salty truth. Younger's Tartan Special was a victim of its own marketing. By wrapping the beer so tightly in a tartan identity, they made it a fashion statement. And in the 1980s, nothing died faster than 70s fashion. The identity fraud. The real logic flip comes from behind the scenes. While British drinkers thought they were supporting a traditional Scottish brew, the company, Scottish and Newcastle, was actually using Tartan Special as a Trojan horse. They used its popularity to buy up regional English breweries, close them down, and replace local favourites with this standardised, factory-made product. They sold us heritage in a can, while systematically destroying the actual heritage of the local English pub. I remember a guy named Tommy, a Scotsman living in Manchester back then. He used to laugh every time someone ordered a tartan. He'd say, "They think they're drinking the Highlands, but they're just drinking the marketing department's idea of a postcard." We traded our local identity for a brand identity. We thought we were being adventurous by drinking something from up north, but we were actually helping the big corporations turn the British pub into a standardised, predictable franchise. We didn't just lose the beer, we lost the map of our own drinking culture. We traded the real for the styled, and once the style went out of fashion, we were left with an empty glass and no local brewery to go back to. In the 1970s, Britain was going through a bit of an identity crisis. We were bored of the grey skies and the lukewarm bitter. We were starting to go on package holidays to Spain and the south of France, and we came back desperate for anything that felt international and continental. Enter Skoll.
If you remember the ads, they were full of Viking imagery, blue skies, and that clean, minimalist Scandinavian aesthetic. The name itself, Skål, was taken from the Swedish word skål, meaning cheers. To the average Brit in a rainy pub in 1974, popping a can of Skål felt like taking a sip of a cold, crisp Swedish fjord. But here is the logic flip that still makes me chuckle. Skål had absolutely nothing to do with Scandinavia. The global blandness experiment. The reality was much more corporate and much less romantic. Skål was actually a product of a global consortium. Allied breweries in the UK teamed up with partners from Canada, Belgium and Sweden to create a world beer. It was the Coca-Cola of lager, designed to be so inoffensive and so light that it could be sold anywhere on the planet. The reality: the Skål you drank in Birmingham was brewed in a lower Scotland, using Scottish water and a very corporate recipe. The profile: psst, glug. At around 3% ABV, it was essentially alcoholic water with delusions of grandeur. It was thin, fizzy, and served so cold that your taste buds were too frozen to realize there wasn't actually any flavor. The salty insight. Why did the fraud work? Because Skål provided sophistication for the masses. In the 70s, foreign was a synonym for better. We didn't want the local, heavy, dark ale that our grandfathers drank. We wanted the bright, blonde future. We wanted the international dream in a 440-milliliter tin. Skål gave us a Viking helmet and a Swedish name, and we were so desperate for a bit of a broad that we didn't care that the beer was as British as a soggy chip.
Here is the angle most people miss. When actual Scandinavians finally came to Britain and tried Skål, they reportedly thought it was a practical joke. To them, it tasted like the water they used to wash their actual beer tanks. The survival twist. But here is where the story gets really strange. While Skål is mostly a ghost in Britain today, relegated to the budget shelf of off-licenses, it became one of the best-selling beers in the world, specifically in Brazil. The corporate blandness that made it fail in the UK as people's palates matured was exactly what made it thrive in the heat of South America. It turned out that international water was exactly what people wanted when it was 40 degrees Celsius outside. We traded our local flavorful truth for a foreign fantasy that wasn't even real. We were so busy looking for Vikings in our glasses that we didn't notice our own brewing heritage was being replaced by a room-size IBM computer's idea of a perfectly average drink. I remember my uncle once saying, "It's a great beer if you're not really in the mood for beer." He wasn't wrong. If the 1970s was about the messy Seven party and the 1960s was about medical milk stouts, then the 1980s was the era of the corporate giant. This was the decade of the yuppie, of sleek suits, and of massive mergers. And no brand represented this new Britain better and more tragically than Greenall Whitley Bitter. Based in Warrington, Greenall Whitley wasn't just a brewery, it was an empire. In the 1980s, they were like the McDonald's of the Northwest. Everywhere you turned, there was a Greenall's pub. They owned hundreds of them. Imagine the sound of that decade. Clink, clink, clink. The sound of heavy glass mugs hitting wooden tables in a pub that had just been refurbished with patterned carpets and brass railings. Sss. The sound of a brand new electronic till ringing up a sale. Everything felt bigger, shinier, and more organized. The logic of the accountant. But here is the logic flip that eventually led to their downfall. Greenall Whitley spent so much money on the pubs that they forgot to spend any on the beer. They were obsessed with vertical integration. They wanted to control everything, the factory, the trucks, and the bar where you sat. They launched massive advertising campaigns featuring comedy legends and page 3 models,
desperately trying to convince us that their bitter was the most exciting thing in the world.
The strategy? Use branding to cover up blandness. The result, they became the ale equivalent of that friend who seems normal until you realize they have no personality. The beer was perfectly functional, but it was incredibly boring. It was the background noise of the British pub. The salty truth. Corporate cannibalism. Here's the angle most people miss. Usually when a brewery dies, it's because it went bankrupt. But Greenall Whitley was too successful at the business side of things. In 1991, they did something that shocked the industry. They looked at their spreadsheets and realized that their property, the pubs and hotels, was worth 10 times more than their product, the beer. So the accountants made a cold, calculated decision. They murdered their own brewery. They literally said, "We're actually a hotel and property company that happens to make beer, so let's just stop making beer." It was the ultimate betrayal of the British pub-goer. They kept the buildings, turned many of them into De Vere hotels or posh gastpubs, and just sold other people's beer instead. I remember a regular at a Greenall's pub back then. He told me, "It felt like coming home and finding your family had been replaced by robots. The pub looked the same, the sign was the same, but the soul had been sold for a higher profit margin. We traded heritage for real estate. We learned that to a big corporation, a brewery isn't a place of craft, it's just a line on a balance sheet." Greenall Whitley proved that you can't manufacture popularity with ads if the liquid in the glass has no heart. They gave us the Greenall's world, but they took away the reason to stay for a second pint. If the 1960s gave us the moon landing and the rise of the computer age, then the brewing world decided it wanted a piece of that space-age magic. They didn't want to rely on a grumpy old master brewer with a stained apron anymore. They wanted science. Enter the strangest experiment in British pub history, Brew 10. Imagine a room the size of a small house, filled with humming cabinets, spinning tape reels, and glowing vacuum tubes. This was an IBM mainframe computer in 1967. The giant brewery, Bass Charrington, decided to feed this massive machine a mountain of data. They wanted to find the mathematical equation for the perfect pint.
Whir, click-clack, beep. The computer crunched the numbers and determined that the ideal beer should have exactly 10 specific flavor components, no more, no less. Hence the name, Brew 10. It was the first beer in history designed not by a human palate, but by an algorithm. The logic of the perfect average. The scientists who were now running the brewery believed that if they could balance these 10 components perfectly, they would create a beer that nobody could dislike. It was 3.8% ABV, mathematically calculated to achieve maximum inoffensiveness. The goal was to remove the human error of brewing. The sensation, glug, glug. It was perfectly clear, perfectly carbonated, and perfectly nothing. Because it was designed to please everyone, it ended up exciting no one. Professional tasters at the time described it as a technically perfect and utterly soulless. It was the elevator music of the beer world. It was a liquid spreadsheet. The salty insight, the molecular irony. Here is the angle most people miss. We often laugh at Brew 10 as a failed robot beer, but here is the logic flip. Modern craft breweries are doing exactly what Brew 10 tried to do. Today, high-end breweries use gas chromatography and mass spectrometry to analyze those same flavor compounds, esters, phenols, ketones. The difference: modern brewers use the science to enhance character, while Brew 10 used it to delete it. The 1967 logic: let's use computers to make beer consistent and boring so we can save money. The 2026 logic: let's use computers to make beer weird and complex so we can charge £12 a pint. the death of the algorithm. Brew 10 died a quiet death by the mid-70s. Why? Because drinkers aren't computers. We don't want mathematical balance when we walk into a pub after a long shift. We want a bit of error. We want the slight bitterness that makes our tongue tingle, or the rich maltiness that feels like a hug. I imagine the executives sitting in a boardroom staring at a printout, wondering why the public wasn't buying their perfect 10. They forgot that a pub is a place for emotions, not equations.
We traded the master brewer's instinct for a computer's logic, and we got a drink that tasted like a clinical laboratory. Brew 10 reminds us that just because you can measure something doesn't mean you've captured its essence. You can't put a soul on a punch card. To finish our journey, we're heading to the East End of London, to a place where the air used to smell of roasted malt, spices from the docks, and 300 years of unbroken history. This is the story of Truman's Pale Ale. If the other beers we've talked about were products, Truman's was an institution. Founded in 1666, the same year as the Great Fire of London, the Black Eagle Brewery on Brick Lane wasn't just a factory, it was a sovereign state. They had their own stables, their own coopers, and their own legendary yeast strain. Clink, clink, clink. Imagine the sound of a heavy glass bottle being placed on a dark oak bar. Pop! The ceramic swing top opens with a satisfying snap. Now here is the logic flip that makes Truman's so special. We often think of old brands as being stuck in the past, but Truman's was a paradox. In the 1870s, they were the biggest brewery in the world, pioneering refrigeration and scientific testing before almost anyone else. Yet they refused to touch their core recipe for over 2 centuries. They were simultaneously ancient and cutting edge. They used a yeast strain that had survived the Great Fire, the Industrial Revolution, and the Blitz. When you drank a pint of Truman's in 1950, you weren't just drinking beer, you were drinking a biological time capsule of London's survival. The salty truth, the murder on Brick Lane. But here is the angle that hurts the most. Truman's didn't die because people stopped liking the beer. It didn't die because of a bad computer algorithm or a confusing slogan.
Truman's was murdered by a spreadsheet. In the 1980s, East London began to change. The old docks were closing and the yuppie revolution was beginning. Corporate raiders looked at the Black Eagle Brewery, a massive, sprawling site of historic brickwork in the heart of London, and they didn't see heritage, they saw real estate. The brutal logic? In 1989, the owners, Grand Metropolitan, realised that the land the brewery sat on was worth infinitely more than the beer it produced. The result? They closed the doors on 3 centuries of history, not because they were failing, but because it was more profitable to build luxury flats than to brew legendary ale. Here is the mant irony of the modern world. Today, tech workers and fashion designers pay £3,000 a month to live in authentic industrial conversions in Brick Lane. They sit in their minimalist living rooms, admiring the original brickwork, where men once worked for £3 a day to keep a 300-year-old tradition alive. They love the aesthetic of the history, but the actual history, the liquid, the yeast, the community, was destroyed to make room for their sofas. The final pour. We've looked at 15 beers. Some were terrible, some were medicinal, and some were corporate illusions. But as we finish with Truman's, we see the real pattern. We didn't just lose brands of beer, we lost a world where things were allowed to be slow. We lost a world where a local taste meant something, where a brewery was the heart of a neighbourhood, and where a Saturday night ritual involved a bit of mess, a bit of character, and a lot of soul. The nostalgia Brit isn't just about looking at old cans, it's about remembering that once upon a time we valued the person behind the bar and the place in the glass more than the profit margin on a balance sheet.
So, next time you're in a pub, look at the taps. If you see something local, something unique, or something that looks a bit messy, order it. Drink it for the men at Aston Cross, for the grandmas with their medicinal stout, and for the dads struggling with a party 7. Keep the memory alive. Cheers.